Hello, this is Paul Fiesel from the Summit of Sustainability Award Committee, and we are very pleased today to have Dr. Nick Zingale, Assistant Professor from Cleveland State University, and also the founder of Affinity Consultants. He's going to provide some information today about what sustainability calls us to do. Dr. Zingale?
Thanks, Paul. When we think about this concept of sustainability, the word itself is a bit of an oxymoron. If you think of the root here, to sustain means to carry on, prop up, or to maintain some kind of existing conditions. This oftentimes implies some kind of status quo or stasis. Yet sustainability is really about transitioning, not in just what we do, but how we perceive the world to be and therefore our role in it. We think of the complexity of the Brundtland definition of sustainability and meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We realize that this is a fairly complex thought, one that asks us to not only behave differently today, but to think about how future generations might actually be doing some things. This is a pretty big thought, but if we were to step back and reflect on it a bit, it's really not new to nature, and for that matter, not to the human species. Take a look at this photograph. I find it interesting, and I think a lot of folks that I talk to about sustainability find it interesting that this photograph was actually not taken until the early 1970s. We spent hundreds, if not thousands of years looking out into space, but it wasn't until around 1972 that we actually had the technology to take the picture from space back to Earth. This was the first time that humans ever saw the entire planet from space. The whole system, how fragile life as we know it in this kind of middle of this deep black space. This picture, some may say, changed our consciousness as a species about ourselves and about our place on the planet. The photograph was the outcome and at the critical juncture of what had been happening for many years and is still happening today. The rise of a global economy, the rise of cybernetic technologies for computation and communication, the rise of new networked organization, the rise of environmental science, the rise of modern environmental movement that is based on that science. If we think about transitions, historically by nature, they happen at these complex junctures in which this entire cultural matrix is somehow changed. Some are arguing, and I would tend to agree, that we are in such a historic transitional time in terms of our relationship with nature right now. This picture and what I'm going to be talking about today signifies a historic transition to a new phase of social, political, and economic organizations, a transition to a new phase of knowledge and its use for the improvement of the human condition. So what are the implications of this? Our economies, our societies, our countries are completely a part of the earth. They are all completely dependent on the earth. They will not continue to thrive unless they all function in a way that does not destroy the whole system. If you really think about it, this is the fundamental understanding of sustainability, the ability to maintain the whole system. Unfortunately, what we were doing 25 years ago and what we're doing for the most part today is not fundamentally sustainable. As Charles Darwin once said, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. Although this is a good thought when we think of evolutionary science, how does it relate to sustainability? Well, there are a number of problems with the definition and with Darwin's concepts. The first problem is that it assumes that those capable of rapidly changing to fit the environment are more likely to succeed. This kind of precludes technology and the use of technology. Secondly, and probably even more influential, is it fails to capture the gap between space and time, which has a conceptual roots in cause and effect when considering how we respond to changing conditions. So let's take this a bit further. Unlike a flower or a tree or a bee, it can be argued that humans are conscious of their current conditions and to a large degree are capable of changing their environment. especially now through the use of technology. We can go into our homes when it's hot and put on our air conditioning. We can certainly go in when it's wintertime and turn on our heat, and we can move about the planet to different types of living environments. Because of this, we tend to focus on immediate concerns. When we don't have a definite and clear solution to something, we oftentimes do the next best thing. We evaluate risk. Now, there's been a lot of talk about risk, especially over the last years with what's happening in the banking industry. In fact, some of the most influential organizations in the world today exist to mitigate risk. Think of insurance companies, but there's a lot of others that come to mind. We can make an argument that governments exist not only to help organize society, but they're also there to reduce the risk of societal collapse. We all know already that our businesses deal with risk on a daily basis, and let's face it, we make personal decisions throughout our day, small and large, based on a form of risk evaluation. By nature, though, human beings are generally risk adverse. The picture here shows a typical risk matrix that an organization might be faced with. In the bottom left-hand corner, in the green are lower risks, in the yellow are medium risks, in the orange are higher risks, and the red are the extreme risks. What this slide is depicting is a multi-phase approach to risk. One is the consequence of a major or severe incident taking place, and the other being the likelihood or the possibility that this may ultimately take place. The issue with this, and what this slide leaves out, is this concept or this understanding of time and space. Whenever we think about the consequences of the risk and the likelihood, time and space are relevant elements. So when these two conditions are not met, human beings tend to become a bit more ambivalent about the risk. So in other words, if we are separated in time and space to an event, we have a tendency to become a little less concerned about the risk. This is certainly prevalent in complex systems. The more complex the system becomes, the more difficult it becomes to understand, the more separated we are in time and space, oftentimes the more ambivalent we become about the risk. And as a result, lots of other things are able to enter into the conversation. So let's take the concept of sustainability a little bit further and this issue of perceived risk and relate it to transitioning somewhat. So an argument can be made that we're already experiencing the effects of climate change. However, if you listen to the media, or for that matter, just go to a family get-together, you realize that we're far from agreement on it. The problem is that the climate doesn't necessarily change as much as it transitions. Change and transition are often thought of as one and the same, but they really aren't. Change tends to be rather rapid and recognizable, while transition is a much slower process and often requires a psychological process that is separated in time and space. Let's think about this in terms of risk once again. You can see here the play on lung cancer. In terms of cause and effect, when cause and effect are close in time and space, human beings are pretty good at making the connection between the two. For example, if I were to hold a lit match to your hand, it probably wouldn't take long for you to realize that the cause of your pain is coming from the heat of the match. However, when we try to tackle something as big as climate change, where there are multiple causes, a lot of time between events, and a spatial separation that is not very recognizable at times, attempting to build a comprehensive relationship between cause and effect can be nearly insurmountable. Hence the introduction of politics and the rhetoric on poor science. Instead, what people tend to do is rely on tactics to modify current behaviors by shortening the psychological distance between time and space. If you look at the most recent ads on smoking, and they show these long-term effects that people have to their bodies from smoking, is this play on trying to make the connection between these long-term consequences or effects to these short-term behaviors or causes. This is one of the reasons that the environmental movement is often perceived to be based in a sort of politics of fear, getting people to realize an impact that is potentially a generation away or for that matter may not even occur immediately on this continent, due to our present-day behavior, is no easy task, especially because it relies on a sense that we can know a lot about our current and future state, and therefore we can somehow successfully manage a transition, when in fact actions and decisions exist within a complex array of external conditions from which there is limited influence and control. We can think about this in terms of a local business or a smaller company that's got to compete with organizations in another part of the world operating under different societal constraints. The local company is forced to respond to these conditions, even in the face of desiring to make some other choices. This is not to excuse certain behaviors. It is simply suggesting that organizations exist within a complex system that is not entirely of their making or of their immediate control. Thus leads to a lot of confusion and uncertainty about what to do next. If sustainability as a form of societal transition at this point is beginning to sound overwhelming to you, it probably should. Let's take a look at it in a nutshell so far. Sustainability is about transitioning, even though it's a term that implies maintaining a certain status quo. So right out of the gate, we are into this layer of conceptual confusion with the term itself. Number two, transitioning is difficult because cause and effect are separated in time and space. This requires major psychological leaps in order to make connections between actions and outcomes. Some of these connections could be separated by generations, making it extremely difficult. And number three, managing transition implies a sense of control that is really an overly simplistic view of humanity, which one could argue is experiencing a very complex and convoluted planetary phase of development. So what is it that we can do? Is there a solution to this conundrum, or are we forever to experience the conditions of Sisyphus, pushing the sustainability rock up the hill, only to watch it roll back down? Well, we can think about this in terms of a holistic view of how we make decisions and work through our day. Whenever a person takes on a task, they conceptualize the whole of what they are doing when taking on that task. In other words, we do things for a reason. We don't always consciously evaluate every step of the process, but we tend to have a feel for the bigger picture. It's one of the reasons that governments design constitutions, companies create mission statements, religious institutions follow spiritual guides, communities have a culture, and quite honestly, why we get up in the morning and decide to do anything. We think in terms of the whole and then act appropriately. When you think about sustainability, it's an attempt to create a holistic view of the world from which our thoughts and behaviors can rationally align. The problem with this, and many of you have seen this before, is that we tend to have different views of the world that are not easily reconcilable with one another. It's the main reason that sustainability has been left open for multiple forms of interpretation. To many, this is very frustrating because when we ask questions of the world around us, we tend to expect an answer, not lots of different interpretations of the questions. We tend to seek definitive solutions to complex problems and unfortunately are not very tolerable of the ambiguity associated with this sort of uncertainty. This is the Mars rover from NASA. And I thought this was an appropriate picture because there's a lot on the surface of Mars that is unknowable. So this particular system is overbuilt to try and deal with an unknowable environment. So if we think about ambiguity or we think about uncertainty, what we try to do is create multiple points of traction so that when one area slips, there is something else that is still holding on and moving things forward. With this in mind, there are some things we can do, and if you really look around you, you look within your organizations or within your associations, there's already a lot that's already being worked on. Okay, first, we must try and understand that because of global complexity brought on by unpredictable external pressures, the public and private sectors are not in complete control of their conditions, and are therefore often forced to make decisions that may not align with what many may perceive to be a sustainable choice. At the very least, it becomes the job of the public to remind our leaders of this and to hold both ourselves and our leaders accountable through local action. At times this may seem unfair because some of our local organizations may take the heat, but again, these activities cannot happen in a vacuum. Rather, they require simultaneity in other areas of society. This calls on us to think individually without being hyper-individualistic. The phrase that we've all heard before and seen before, think globally but act locally, comes to mind. When we focus on ourselves and what we can do to live more sustainably, our understanding of what it takes becomes more personal and meaningful. We can do this by making personal commitments while looking for ways to foster a sense of community. And we see organizations such as Walmart and others doing this already, asking their employees to make personal sustainability statements in an effort to make a connection to what the organization is trying to tackle. This, of course, can happen at the level of the individual and at the organizational level. Getting involved with the community to help shape attitudes and values while making personal and organizational commitments. This might mean attending community-sponsored events, becoming more involved with religious congregations that are working towards sustainability, helping out schools even when your kids aren't there, mentoring programs, food drives, sponsoring and working in the community cleanup days, hiring displaced workers, the list goes on and on. Nonetheless, it's very important to recognize that the first steps are within the walls of your own home and institution and to a large degree within your own mind. Secondly, if we are to appreciate that we are approaching a planetary phase of human development, this will require a new way of measuring and understanding what it means to live a fulfilling and meaningful life. The challenge in the 21st century is to avoid irreversible environmental changes while generating enough social and economic development opportunities to reduce poverty and inequity. This is not to say that we don't strive for economic superiority. What it does say is that we put the economy in its place. It says that we recognize that economic superiority is embedded within the context of society and the environment. If we don't have a good environment, if we don't have a good society, we will struggle to have a good economy. In recognizing this, we can begin to apply a different and unique standard of measures for societal progress from which to interpret success. This can lead to a new economy, a new way of measuring, a new way of taking us out of the myopic measures that we are currently using today to determine if we are living a quality and worthwhile life. I'm going to switch over here to a video that was done by Robert Kennedy in 1968. Bear with me a minute as I pull this up.
Too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product now is over $800 billion a year. But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising, and ambulances to clear our highway of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwoods and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm, and it counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts Whitman rifles and sex knives and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile.
Okay. Looks like we pause here, but it was just about over anyways. Now, if we think about this, what Robert Kennedy is talking about are these indicators or these measures that are go beyond what we traditionally measure and interpret to be fundamental indicators of whether or not we're having or we're living a good life. This diagram that's being shown here, believe it or not, was done by Deutsche Bank in 2007. So there's been areas of the world that have been working on these extended indicators for some time to look at new economics measures. But you can see here where GDP itself is just a small space within the different measures that we can look at for a larger idea or a larger concept of economic well-being, and certainly a larger concept of our living conditions. And many of you might be familiar with happiness factors and what's being created with this idea of happiness factors. Beginning to think about these different measures and how an organization or an individual or even a society or community can begin to extend what they're currently measuring to start measuring different things, putting weights to different things, and working this into the decision-making process is a trick, but it's already being done. For those of you that are interested in this, you can go to Maryland. The state of Maryland has been doing a lot with work on the general progress indicator, which again is this extension of these metrics and these measures. And I'm going to say a few more things about this in a few minutes here about how this can be worked into our thinking on return on investment. So back to this idea of how we kind of get to this and can begin to work through these barriers of this thinking. This is a little bit of a complex slide, but this is a transitioning slide. And what it says is that oftentimes when we leave one way of thinking about a situation, we experience an ending phase. And that ending phase is almost like a loss. And to some degree, it can be a loss of identity. And it's one of the reasons why sustainability is such a challenge, because we are oftentimes asking people to give up what they know. And that's especially difficult to do because if you look at this blue line here, there are a number of constraints that hold the society or the organization thinking in that way. And because of that, it's not as easy to imagine something being different. We are constrained by what is already there within our own organizations or within our own society, and therefore it becomes difficult to imagine something different. However, if we move into this neutral zone, the trick here is to minimize or to soften these constraints, to create some space for some reimagining to take place. And if that reimagining can gain some traction and some momentum, we can begin to see it move into a new way of thinking that has minimal types of constraints associated with it. One way to think about this internal to an organization or internal to a society is to think about this in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. And what this slide shows, if we were to follow this line up, is that we tend to take on most sustainability initiatives by looking at organizational efficiency or societal efficiencies, water efficiency, energy efficiency. The issue with this is that we will be forced to tap out that efficiency, and eventually it will flatline. And we can only get so efficient with an existing process. Managers tend to kind of do the right thing and to drive efficiency within their organization. However, leaders focus on what's most effective, the right things to do. And this can take a couple of different lines. Oftentimes, green environmental managers want to focus on this effectiveness, and you can see they may slightly regress in trying to move towards optimal sustainability. However, one way to build on this is to build on the works of optimal efficiency. And then when you feel like you're reaching this point where you can't get much more efficient in what you're doing, think about sustainable redesign. Think about challenging those types of constraints that exist within your organization to reimagine something different, to look at how you can move towards optimal sustainability and potentially some new beginnings. Okay, One way to kind of bring this together, this transitioning concept along with this return on investment, is to think about this in terms of value. Ultimately, organizations and societies exist to create some sort of value. What it means for an organization to create value is an ever-evolving process. Sustainability is just the latest interpretation of this. It requires organizations to think and act differently, not only to respond to societal pressure, but to shape what this might mean by extending the understanding of value as a return on investment. Typically, what we look at here is our bottom line investments, which get at these efficiency-related issues. And if you look at this, this is our return on investment line and the cost that we're putting forward. If we were then to look at some top-line values that come from our decisions, we see that the return on investment line can be shifted down when we begin to put some value in market share, organizational reputation or societal reputation, customer satisfaction, efficiencies, improved efficiencies, quality of life. But yet there's another dimension to this that gets at even greater factors, and that's societal value. And if we can begin to put some value in our decision-making to societal value and begin to work that through, we now see environmental health improvements, societal cohesiveness being things that we can begin to look at the valuation from the types of decisions that we are making. Now this is difficult, no doubt about it, because we still tend to measure things in dollars and cents. And our policies reward these activities in dollars and cents. But we can begin to start to look at these things within our organizations, within our own societies. And if we can start putting some values to this, this can begin to shape our view of how we begin to think about our sustainability types of initiatives. And the bottom line of this whole thing is that this is hard stuff. As I talked about in a nutshell, there are some significant barriers to moving towards sustainability. And getting beyond these types of barriers, the confusion of the word, the relationships between cause and effect, the politics of fear behind these things are no easy tasks, but we've got to begin. And we've got to begin with the idea in mind that there are going to be setbacks. There are going to be challenges, because the challenge towards sustainability and sustainable transitions are not easy. They're not difficult. They're relatively difficult barriers to get behind, certainly by moving into some kind of measurement effect or some kind of new economy, and getting involved with our community are a few of the ways that we can begin to move forward and be the change that we want to see in the world. That's all I have for you today. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Dr. Zingale. That was a great presentation. It really helps us to better understand some of the complexity associated with these really sometimes difficult organizational changes, as well as some of the drivers that hopefully our organizations can take advantage of in integrating sustainability into not only the way they do business for their bottom line, but the way they do business for future generations. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the presentation.